The row may be between neighbors on the Arabian Peninsula. The implications, though, stretch far and wide after Saudi Arabia led a Gulf states recall of ambassadors to Qatar last week. Riyadh then going one further on Friday by branding the Doha-backed Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. It's part of a long-standing rivalry over who holds sway in places like Egypt, where the king was quick to offer billions after last year's overthrow of the Brotherhood-backed government. But why now? And why has Riyadh also decided to distance itself from the Islamists fighting in Syria, ordering home all Saudi subjects within 2 weeks and branding as terrorists in the same decree the Al-Nusra Front and ISIS, a group which operates in both Syria and Iraq? That clean break leaves Baghdad unmoved. In an interview with France 24, Iraq's Shiite Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki bluntly accusing both Saudi Arabia and Qatar of directly backing the Sunni uprising in Anbar province. Finally, as the Saudis fret over a possible détente between the West and Shiite Iran, the U.S. president's preparing to visit Saudi Arabia later this month. We'll see what that visit, whether that visit will soothe Saudi jitters. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Saudi Arabia upping the tone, and with us to talk about it from Abu Dhabi, Faisal Al-Yafai, chief columnist at daily newspaper The National. Thank you for joining us. Also with us, longtime Syrian dissident Haytham Manna, president of the Scandinavian Institute for Human Rights. Welcome back, sir. Welcome as well to Olivier Darage, whose books include 30 Years That Rocked the Persian Gulf. He is with sister station Radio France International, and also joining us, analyst and legal counsel Ardavan Amir Aslani. Welcome back. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag F24debate. The recall of ambassadors was last Wednesday, but it's, as we say in newsroom parlance, a story with legs. Faisal, we're getting news that there are longtime Emirati sports reporters at Al Jazeera Sports Network who've tendered their resignation. Al Jazeera say they were pressured. We're also hearing similar noises elsewhere. What have you heard from where you are in Abu Dhabi?
Well, I think the stuff about the media and Al Jazeera and the sports channels and stuff, I think this is really something that's happening on the sidelines. The real question is about this disagreement between Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar. I mean, I wouldn't overstate it. It is a very serious thing. The recall of these ambassadors is unprecedented, but it doesn't mean that they have fallen out of love with each other. These are countries, after all, that remain in a political union in the GCC and in a military union through Peninsula Shield. So, and there are, of course, these long-standing ties of family and business and so forth. So I think the right way to categorize it is to say that this is something almost an interfamilial conflict. But it is serious, it is unprecedented, and I think, as you say, it is something that's going to run for a little while longer until they can solve it diplomatically.
You're saying that make it sound almost like a family feud, but nonetheless, branding the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, that's a pretty clear signal to Doha.
Yes, I mean, it's not something that the Saudis are doing out of nowhere. I mean, it is a mood in the Arab world that has shifted against the Brotherhood. You've seen, of course, millions of people on the streets demonstrating for the removal of Mohamed Morsi last summer. You saw similar protests on a smaller scale in Tunisia that led to the removal or the change in government, which took Al-Nahda out of their pivotal role in the General Assembly. So it's a part of a mood that's happening across the entire region at this moment, and I think the Saudis are reacting to that. Within the GCC, there's definitely a feeling of frustration with the Qataris, a sense that perhaps the Qataris haven't grasped quite how dangerous the Gulf states see the Muslim Brotherhood as.
Olivier Darage?
Well, there are many questions, no? Muslim Brotherhood is all what Saudi Arabia despises. First of all, they're horizontal organization, whereas monarchs want to rule from the top. They mobilize people in the name of Islam, which is supposed to be the prerogative of those Muslim leaders. and they're seen like Freemasonry within the peninsula. So when you see that one of them is supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, all the neighbors really fret about it.
One of them supporting it, but Ardavan Amir Aslani, it's a bit of an overstretch to label that organization as a terrorist organization.
You know, Faisal pointed out to the notion that there's a change of mood in the Middle East. I don't think there's a change of mood at grassroots level. I think there's a change of mood at the royal family's level. What happened in Egypt is a coup d'etat that brought into power the old Egyptian military attaché in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, with the assistance of billions of dollars of Saudi financing for the post-coup government to be able to maintain stability. I'm not certain that the Muslim Brotherhood has been forgotten and the entire Islamic population in the Middle East has turned over them. As a matter of fact, the exact contrary is true. That's why all these Persian Gulf Arab countries are freaking out at the sight of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's why they're pointing fingers at Qatar. Muslim Brotherhood is a grassroots political advocacy group which preaches what something like the sheikdoms in the Persian Gulf don't like, that is Islamic rule, which basically means if the Muslim Brotherhood were to prevail anywhere in that part of the world, it's the end of the royal families. And what you're witnessing over here, aside from this chasm between these Gulf monarchies, is basically two different groups supporting and defending two different versions of Islam. On the one side, you've got Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood, and on the other, you've got the Saudis and the Emiratis who are defending other versions of radical Islam, the Takfir Wahhabi movement that is omnipresent in Syria. So it is not, secular democratic people pointing fingers at a terrorist organization called the Muslim Brotherhood. It's one radical version of Islam against another. And all this within an environment, with an atmosphere that is witnessing the return of Iran into the international community. The visit of Mrs. Ashton today is testimony to that, and the unique interview that you realized yesterday, 2 days ago, with the Iraqi Prime Minister also demonstrates that this rift goes beyond the Sunni concept and also entails the rise of Shia Iran and the new distribution of power in the Middle East.
Haytham Manna, when you're speaking with fellow Syrians, how much does theology play into it, I guess is the question.
Before arriving to Syria, we can speak about a structural problem between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, essentially. Saudi Arabia now is the old-fashioned family with some minister for more than my age in power, and it's not really adapted with many questions of our time. They tried to open in the Syrian question with Bandar bin Sultan, but Bandar failed. On the other side, Qatar, you have the Tamim and the heritage of his father, the father Amir, what we call Amir al-Ab. The heritage of the father is Qaradawi and Council of Muslim Ulema.
All right, let's explain that. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's a preacher who is on Al Jazeera.
He is also the Mufti of Qatar.
And he's
officially is
very popular, and he annoys the Saudis a lot because he...
And he is, at the same time, one of the financial and propaganda and ideological aid of Muslim Brotherhood.
All right, let me ask on this. Olivier Daraj, there was back in November this meeting that took place between the King of Saudi Arabia, the Emir of Qatar. The new Emir, who's 33 years old, said he would tone things down. But here we are, and again 2 weeks ago we heard some very harsh criticism of both Abu Dhabi and of Riyadh from Yusuf al-Qaradawi on Al Jazeera.
Yes, because the UAE and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia are just exasperated by Qatar, and the press even more. And I think this is a strategic mistake, because the new Emir wanted to keep things quiet, and now he has no choice but to follow the path of his father. And okay, they have withdrawn 3 ambassadors. Kuwait, Oman have not. Now what do we do? After a few weeks, a few months, do we send them back? Do we break the diplomatic relations? Now, they talk about severing the the links between Qatar and Saudi Arabia on the coast. Well, on the earth side of Qatar, they can do it. Now, if they do it with the sea, that's another story. There is an American base on Qatar. So the whole thing, military base.
Yeah.
Now, I think the exasperation lacks of a strategic sight of what's going to happen in the next few months.
Right, so the exasperation is not backed up by a plan, is what you're saying at this particular point.
That we'll find out in a few months, but I doubt it.
All right, a comment from one of the viewers. Please look up the ideologies that Qatar supports and follows. It has nothing to do with the Brotherhood. Ardavan, you agree with Olivier, the Gulf Cooperation Council proving it's divided over this?
No, I think he's perfectly right. But at the same time, I'm also in full agreement with what Faisal said. These are all similar institutions fighting against each other. It is a family feud. You're dealing with, medieval-style feudal monarchies with absolute powers, without any presence of any democratic value in any of these Persian Gulf Arab states. None of them. So they are in a fight today and a rift because they believe that Qatar does not seem to understand the dangers that in their mind the Muslim Brotherhood personifies. I insist upon this. The Muslim Brotherhood, it was specified as a grassroots organization that is hugely popular in these states. If it were not, if it were an insignificant entity, it wouldn't have led to this road that we're witnessing today. But they're compelled to reach an agreement because at the end of the day, they are fighting for their own survival. Because what they're fighting for against today are two things. The return of Iran, which we need to insist upon, and that's why everybody's freaking in town today. And number two, the fact that there is an alternative political option that is popping up in all of these countries, replacing monarchies by a theocracy ruled by a Muslim Brotherhood structure institution. That's what makes
disagreeing with you is Carla on Twitter. She's says
got the right.
The Saudis denouncing the Muslim Brotherhood is political and not for the purposes of defeating terrorism. She is underwhelmed by the threat there. Haytham Manna.
The problem, I like to continue my idea. The problem in Qatar, the most important movement, as political movement in Qatar, is Salafit. It's not Muslim Brotherhood. Muslim Brotherhood, you have about 7-10%. And all Muslim Brotherhood in Qatar are foreigners. That means there's no problem. In a moment, we can put them out. In Saudi Arabia, it's different. Muslim Brotherhood movement still in Saudi Arabia for more than 30 years as the bastion, as really Muhammad Qutb, all the leaders of Muslim Brotherhoods, which were not in prison in Egypt, were in Saudi Arabia. And for that, they have a network, a great network in the country. It's not the same thing. And if we look to that, in Emirates, they try to do something. And they have an organization. They are more important than Salafist movement in Emirates. For that, they must stop this movement because Dubai, for example, cannot live with such kind of organization. A commercial center without resource, local resource, and with living with a free trade. We cannot open for any political Islamic movement there to keep this prosperity, exceptional prosperity, which we live. And if you understand the situation, the economical one, it's not only the influence, for example, of Saudi Arabia or Qatar in Syria, because this influence, there is a conflict also. You know that Jarba and the coalition now is pro-Saudi.
I'm going to interrupt you there.
Yes.
We'll talk about Syria in a moment, but Faisal Al-Yafai, a final thought on this.
Yes, I want to come back on something that Amir said, and I think Haytham picked up. Excuse me, Ardavan, I'm sorry. I'm happy to take fashion tips from you, as I said on Twitter, but I think I'll have to disagree with the politics. This talk about the Muslim Brotherhood is really talk about the Brotherhood from 2011. The Brotherhood went into power in Egypt, let's not forget, and they were voted out, not officially, but with millions and millions of people coming out onto the streets saying that they had had enough of this organization that tried to accrue as much power as it could to itself, that tried to change the constitution to make it more Islamic. The same thing happened in Libya, where the Islamists lost the election. The same thing happened in Tunisia. When you're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood being something grassroots, something that people want, they had elections, they won it. The second point is about the monarchies. Let's be clear that the Brotherhood have not supplanted any single monarchy during the Arab Spring. That is a fact that has not occurred. Now, let's look at monarchies where there are some Islamists, such as in Jordan, such as in Morocco. In both those cases, they have made accommodations with them. So this idea that the monarchies and the Brotherhood are fundamentally opposed to each other is a mistake. The truth of the matter is there has been a seismic shift in the Arab understanding of the Brotherhood, and the Saudis are not leading this. They are reacting to what is happening on the ground in the region.
Just on that, Faisal, before we go to the break, Qatar is tiny. We've talked about it's several 100,000 citizens, but strategically located, sharing territorial waters with Iran, all those reserves there. How strong is the bargaining position of Doha?
Well, like I say, I don't think it is right to characterize it as this furious disagreement where they're going to bargain on either side. The truth of the matter is they all want to come together. Part of the reason I think that we're seeing this public disagreement is because the Americans, as we'll talk about later, are coming soon. And I think as much as the Saudis will have a frosty reception for Barack Obama, they also want to be sure that they can present the GCC as a united front. And that is unlikely to happen unless they can bring Qatar into the fold and make it agree with the discussions that they've had for the last 3-4 months.
All right, and Barack Obama's upcoming visit before the end of the month to Saudi Arabia. We'll be talking about it again when we come back here on the France 24 debate. Stay with us, more to come. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. Saudi Arabia is firing on all cylinders. In part one of our discussion, we were talking about how last week it recalled its ambassador to Qatar. There's more, and we're going to talk about it now with our guests. Faisal Al-Yafai, chief columnist for Abu Dhabi Daily, The National. Thank you for being back with us, as well to longtime Syrian dissident Haytham Manna, president of the Scandinavian Institute for Human Rights. From sister station Radio France International, Olivier Darage, and analyst and legal counsel Ardavan Amir Aslani. We're also going to talk about Syria, where last Friday there was mention made by the Saudis that they were listing as a terrorist organization not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but also hardline Sunni groups at the Al-Nusra Front and ISIS, both of them linked to Al-Qaeda. Olivier Darage, let me ask you about the timing of all of this. It's why is this pronouncement from the Saudis coming now? Some people are also putting into the mix the fact that the man who had been in charge of Syria for the Saudis, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the long-time ambassador to the United States for years and years, has been relieved of that post and replaced by the head of security.
Yes, there has been a change of strategy, but I think we should not make too much of the date when all this is being announced. I mean, this had been bringing up for a long time, many months, and that frustration just came to fruition, so to speak. Why did they ask all the jihadis to come back? Otherwise they would face long-term jail. They have the experience of Afghanistan, and they sent jihadis in Afghanistan, and when they came back, you had the
But hang on a second, we all had the experience of Afghanistan before the conflict of Syria even began.
Saudi Arabia was
what, they realized it after 3 years?
No, that was before, but they thought they could control it. And now they think that because Qatar is putting money after money, the whole thing is getting out of hand.
Faisal Al-Yafai, you agree?
Oh, I think there's definitely been a recalibration of the Saudi strategy, and the reason for that is very clear. The ground has shifted beneath the feet of all the actors in Syria over 3 long years of a brutal conflict. So I think, yes, there was this belief in the beginning that if arms were provided to some of these rebel groups, not all of whom were particularly savory characters, then Assad would be toppled and it would follow one of the other Arab Spring trajectories. That hasn't happened, and unfortunately ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra have taken on a very nasty sectarian and deeply religious perspective. And I think that the Saudis now are saying it is time to rein back our strategy and look for a new one, a more counter-terrorism strategy than an attempt to remove Assad by force.
And the fact that Prince Bandar is no longer the man in charge when it comes to Syria for Riyadh, how do you explain that shift away from him?
Well, yes, I mean, they've shifted it to Hamad bin Naif, the interior minister. I think that is, as Olivier pointed out, something that has been brewing for some time now. The Saudis, ahead of this visit by Barack Obama, are going to be on the same page as the US. And I think as the threat of military action against the Assad regime has receded, the Saudis have recognized that the old strategy is no longer working and they have to find a new one. That's why you've seen them designate these two groups, and it's why you've seen them say to their nationals to be back within 2 weeks or face jail time.
All right. Comments coming in from a lot of viewers, including whatever happened to Arab Brotherhood. Is it that fragile, or is there no such thing to begin with? Haytham Manna, that order for all Saudi nationals who are fighting in Syria to return home, do you think it will be heeded?
I'll answer, but before I must make some remarks about the intervention of our friend. First of all, al-Nusra, it's really new thing in the dictionary of Saudi Arabia, because never they condemned Jabhat al-Nusra up to now. But al-Nusra, now we know that they are more pro-Qatar than Saudi Arabia. And this is very important.
How do we know that?
You know, all of these people now are multi-financial sources, organization. They become very experimented people, and they have more than one country and more than group to be financed by. But these groups have a political orientation. We don't find, for example, Ahrar al-Sham or Islamic Front in this list, because Islamic Front, the head of Islamic Front, is pro-Saudian. But they have the same ideology. Both, they have the same ideology. There's no difference between Ahrar al-Sham, a member of Islamic Front, and al-Nusra.
But do you take Faisal's point that
yes,
the strong criticism that Prince Bandar had made over the fact that the U.S. didn't intervene in Syria, that now they're pulling back from that because they realize it's never going to happen?
No, before that, you know that Islamic Front was really the child of Saudi Arabia first. And then Qatar tried to have an influence via Ahrar al-Sham, which had an historical relationship with Al-Qaeda. Abu Khalid al-Suri, we know, and Tartusi, we know that they were leaders in Al-Qaeda, number 4 and 1 in the direction. Now the situation is that you have two directions. One is of Saudi Arabia, which is Zahran al-Lush and Islamic Front, and the other, al-Nusra, is more than pro-Qatari than other thing. We know that al-Nusra has always a good relationship with many journalists and many personalities which are classified as terrorists in Qatar. And for that, you have this problem of division between two forces, the Free Army and Islamic Front.
So there's what's
Saudi Arabia,
there's what's
and yes, and the other side, you have the pro-Qatari forces.
So there's what the palace says, and then there's what happens actually in the field. Faisal Al-Yafai.
Just let me respond to what Haytham was saying. I have an enormous amount of respect for Haytham's views, and as you see there, the detail that he's talking about is absolutely correct. There is this fragmentation of the Syrian Civil War, but let's not lose sight of the fact that it did not begin like this. The end that we see today was not foreseeable at the beginning. All of the other Arab Spring countries had come to some resolution very rapidly, and I think the Saudis and other backers like the Turks really believed that they could end the conflict swiftly. That is what they were trying to do. It is what actually I've been arguing the international community should have done as well. Since that hasn't happened, it's the fragmentation that has led us to this place, to the detail that Haytham was pointing out. And that, I think, is why the Saudis are now sort of shifting as the Americans are.
All right, so that's scaring off at least the leaders in Riyadh. Certainly, though, there's no quietening of the tone within the Syrian National Council. That's the opposition group in exile whose president, Ahmed al-Jarba, backed by Riyadh, and who narrowly beat out a Qatari-backed candidate last year to run the organization. He was vocal at a weekend Arab League meeting in Cairo.
After the failure of Geneva II and the oppressive invasion of Yabrud, there's no space for diplomacy or political solutions. They, the Syrian regime, have responded to our positive position with a clear message refusing the political solution by launching tank rockets and dropping explosive barrels from airplanes on civilians. And the response to this must be the same.
All right, so tooth for a tooth, an eye for an eye, and that again by the guy who's backed by Saudi Arabia.
Now, you know, the problem with the Syrian National Coalition is that they only represent themselves. They don't have any material control over the Islamic fighters on the ground in Syria.
Haytham, do you agree?
Yes, and it's a fact, and I think no one can question this. That being said, I think chronology is of importance. The simple fact that you've got the Saudis today calling back their citizens, declaring these movements, the Jabhat al-Nusra and the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, as terrorists, is important. It's only happening today, as was mentioned. These movements have been designated as terrorist organizations for more than a year by the international community, including the United States. This means that the Saudis and all these other folks have been financing these terrorist organizations for more than a year, and it's only now that they're changing.
And this
is a factual vindication of the assertion of the Prime Minister of Iraq, who's saying exactly the same thing, that the Saudis and Qataris are financing Islamic Sunni Wahhabi terrorism, and Wahhabi terrorism is basically an oxymoron in the area. And why are they changing this? Because we should remember, Obama is going to visit the Saudis end of this month, and they want to provide a better picture to the Americans, saying that, look, we've changed our attitude. We're no longer going to throw money at these terrorist organizations, as you wanted us to abstain from doing, and we'll try to behave correctly. And they're also witnessing one genuine fact in the area. That is, despite the fact that they're fighting against each other, there is a Shia-Sunni rift that is also increasing, and that's what Nouri al-Maliki pointed out recently. And that is of fundamental importance.
All right, let's go to Nouri al-Maliki. First, I'll tell you about, again, lots of comments from viewers. One of them saying they use the term terrorism for their narrow political advantages rather than as a security measure, with a mix of Sunni tribesmen and jihadist radicals overrunning parts of the Ramadi, the capital of Iraq's Anbar province, in December, battling since both there and in Fallujah. Iraq's prime minister brushing aside talks of proxies and private initiatives. Speaking to France 24's Mark Perlman on Saturday, Nouri al-Maliki squarely blaming the Saudi and Qatari governments alike for the rise of Sunni radicals both in Syria and Iraq.
Those countries are mobilizing jihadists. Those jihadists coming from Europe, coming from Belgium, from France and other countries, European countries. Who brought them here? Those are commissions, Saudi commissions, that are organizing all this to attract those jihadists, to lure them, to get them into fighting in Iraq. And since Saudi Arabia forbade from its citizens to travel to Syria and to Iraq, they turned to the Western countries of the Arab world and to Europe to attract new jihad fighters.
Olivier Dallage?
When you see the region with the eyes of a Saudi, this guy has been put in power by the Americans, and he is the proxy for the Iranians. So obviously, I mean, they feel encircled, surrounded by enemies.
By the way, the Saudis this Monday coming out with a statement saying that his remarks were dangerous and irresponsible.
Well, that's the least they could say after what they heard. But the fact is that they did not recognize the elections in Iraq. They kept him at bay, and obviously he's paying back in kind.
Faisal Al-Yafai?
This is a very important point from Olivier. It is unfortunately Mr. Maliki speaking with the voice of Iran. This is actually incredibly dangerous rhetoric. It really escalates the situation beyond where it needs to be. And to hear Nouri al-Maliki, of all people, the man who has been Prime Minister of Iraq for more years than anyone else this century, the man more responsible for the sectarian divide in Iraq today than any other person, for him to be saying that it's the Gulf states fomenting sectarian hatred is really astonishing. You start to wonder what world he's living in. The fact of the matter is that it is Maliki who has been promoting this sectarian divide to shore up his own Shia support. And if he is seeking to take one of the most important Arab countries into Iran's orbit, he cannot be surprised. And at the same time, marginalizing his Sunni population, 40% of whom, 40% of Iraqis are Sunnis. So if he's expecting that the Gulf states and the rest of the Arab world are going to sit back quietly while one of the most important Arab states is taken into the Iranian orbit, he's really got to reconsider his position. I recognize that in a month's time he will face election, but there's a difference between politicking and naked, willful forgetting of the facts.
Ardavan?
Nouri al-Maliki, contrary to the other Persian Gulf monarchies, was elected. I mean, he may be in power for some time, but he didn't come to power through a coup d'etat. Sorry, as Faisal puts it, voted into power by coup d'etat. This man is elected. And today, what he hasn't been throwing dynamite at the Sunnis. What is happening today in Iraq is the civil war in Syria overflowing.
He hasn't been throwing dynamite at the Sunnis, but he did add...
but I mean, he's reacting to what is
he did
pouring
hit
out
his
of
vice
Syria.
President with charges. There was the killing of a bodyguard.
But that's not civil war. But what is happening today is what is pouring out of Syria into Iraq. Look where the strife is concentrated. It is not in the Shia south. It is not in the Iraqi Kurdistan. It's right across the Syrian border. And these are people, they're same guys that have been qualified as terrorists and have been withdrawn by the Saudis yesterday, are the same guys who are going across the frontier, creating local difficulties at Fallujah and at Radi. It's the same story. And what he's doing today is that he's calling in his army to maintain control of the unity of the country. The civil war in Syria is spreading into Iraq with the same financial backers as the Islamist terrorists had in Syria, meaning Saudi Arabia and the others in the area.
Haytham Manna, this brings us back to Barack Obama's visit later this month.
Before visit Obama, I think there is a problem between our friend Faisal and
Ardavan.
You know, in Iraq, really, if you take the historical recent events, the first speaking about a house, a sectarian house, was by some people. One of them is al-Maliki. And al-Bayt al-Shi'i, the Shia house, was the idea to win elections, because we have a majority of Shia in Iraq and we can win elections rapidly with this propaganda. And many TV before Saudi Arabia, sectarian TV, were authorized in Iraq, unfortunately. Now he understands that it was a great mistake, and now he pays the price, because now we have more than 100 TV, sectarian TV, Sunni against Shia and Shia against Sunni, and we have really an ideological war and a religious war between two great groups, and we pay the price in Syria and Iraq. For that, if you take now this declaration of Maliki, you can put it easily in the electoral propaganda, because he prepared the new elections in this time.
Many governments in the area played that sectarian card just to delegitimize the opposition. It happens in Saudi Arabia, it happens in Iraq, it happens in Bahrain. It's not much talked about, but this is very important, what's happening in Bahrain, and to a lesser extent elsewhere. And the idea is to prevent Sunni or Shia who oppose the government to get together, and it succeeds.
All right, on Twitter, this comment, surely not the diplomacy you'd expect from diplomats more like tit for tat. That a reference, I think, to the Qataris versus the Saudis. They need an intervention. I don't know what Shuja means by that, but we'll get back to that point later. Let me ask you, Faisal Al-Yafa, again, this brings us to Barack Obama's visit later this month to Riyadh, his first since 2009. What does he need to be saying, the U.S. president?
Actually, I don't think that anything Barack Obama says is going to make a difference. And I think that's really the essential point. And we've seen it all across the region. And actually, we're seeing it in Ukraine today, that the problem has been that Barack Obama has played to his strengths, and his strengths have been speaking rather than acting. That's one of the reasons why the region is in such a difficult situation. Certainly in Syria, it is because Barack Obama and the Americans put forward these spurious red lines about chemical weapons use, which the Assad regime happily trampled across, and then the Americans backed off and said, well, that's life. The same sort of thing happened with Ukraine and the Crimea and the Russians' intervention. The fact of the matter is, when the Americans have tried to involve themselves in the region without understanding the dynamics of the region, it has gone wrong, as in Iraq. When the region was speaking to them with a clear voice, a very clear voice, 2 years ago, and saying the situation in Iraq and Syria will consume all of us, you need to find a solution to this, their only response was to let it run and let it run and let it run. And as we were saying earlier, the ground shifted. It is not merely that the fight has changed. It is, as Haytham pointed out, that this opening of the Pandora's box of sectarianism has consumed the entire region. It's become a real thing. It wasn't a real thing before, but it's become one. So I'm not quite sure what Obama can come and say. What I'd like to have is for him to come and do something.
Haytham Manna, you're someone who's been against an arms race over Syria and against fighting to resolve the conflict. What were the United States' options 2 years ago, and what are the options now?
I'm against, but really all of us suffer from the absence of a strategy of Mr. Obama in the Middle East.
What could that strategy be, though, at this point?
You don't have any map road. You don't have any really answer for many questions. And now you have two positions, sometime in 1 week, from the States, sometimes from Kerry here and from him in the other side. And our problem that we don't know what he can do when he will go to Riyadh or to Amman or to any capital. I don't know what will he propose for these people. To attack Syria from the south, for example, ask Jordanian and Saudi to do a job which they cannot do, or to support military some groups, or he don't have any plan.
All right, so yeah, but what does Barack Obama do at this point? What is his strategy? If it's not in military intervention, what is it?
You know, when you don't like to intervene military, you must push the political solution to be a reality. And he didn't help for any political solution.
But you see, a political solution means bringing the Iranians and the Russians in, and at this point in time...
No, I'm speaking, for example, about Syria. About Syria, really the role of, the responsibility of Americans and Russia in the field of Geneva II is clear. It's not Brahimi who was the reason of what happened.
Ardavan.
Obama is going into Saudi Arabia so as to try to amend the broken relationship. The Saudis never digested the fact that the Americans embarked upon this rapprochement with the Iranians months and months before Rouhani was elected, in secret talks in Muscat, in Oman, and they felt totally kept out of it. And they're fearing the energetic independence of the United States. They're fearing the increasing oil export capacity of Iraq. They feel that America is turning elsewhere and abandoning them in the Middle East into the hands of a rising Iran. They are panicking, and the way they act in the entire area is a consequence of what they feel is a behind-the-scenes entente between Iran and the US, and they may not be wrong.
So, Olivier Delage, how does the Saudi leadership feel when it sees images of the European Union diplomacy chief, Catherine Ashton, wearing her veil in Tehran?
They feel exactly like Netanyahu. They're not happy, but they can't do much about it. And vis-à-vis the US, they've been furious for the past 3 years. But I think that this visit tells something. Nothing spectacular is going to come out of it, but they need to be reassured, that's true. And only 3 years ago, the Saudis prevented top officials from the US to visit Saudi Arabia. Now, at the end of the day, they know that both from Washington and from Riyadh, that they need each other. They're not very happy about it, but I mean, there is no alternative.
Faisal Al-Yafai, is something broken for good between Washington and Riyadh?
No, it's not broken at all. It can be mended. Erdogan's analysis of this is absolutely correct. It is the Saudis who are very concerned about this rapid rapprochement between the Iranians and the Americans. Can it be fixed? Of course it can, but it will take real action and it will take real reassurance on the part of the Americans. Remember, the monarchies of the Persian Gulf have spent a lot of time, energy and money to help the Americans, and they have been very good allies to the United States. And so when they see their traditional ally, the United States, shifting and moving into the orbit of one of their bitter enemies, the Iranians, you can imagine that they don't take it very kindly. I think it'll be that discussion that you will hear coming out of Riyadh when Obama goes there later this month.
And Faisal, this ages-old rift between the Sunnis on the one hand, the Shiites on the other, is there any way to overcome this?
Well, I don't believe that this rift is real. This is a particular, actually I think I've said it's an Orientalist perspective from the perspective of Europe, because Europe of course had these wars between the Protestants and the Catholics. Nothing on that scale has ever existed between the Sunnis and the Shia, and if you talk about the regional countries, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, there is an enormous amount of intermarriage, enormous links, enormous ties of friendship, of family. The idea that there is this discrepancy between the Sunnis and the Shias is ridiculous. It is entirely a political construction. Once the politics are fixed, the religious element will go away.
Well, I hope that Faisal is right. I need to thank him, by the way, for having called the Persian Gulf by its genuine name. But that being said, we need to acknowledge one fact. This rift between Shia and Sunni has been ongoing for more than 1,000 years. People are dying by the dozens, by the hundreds in the streets of Syria. People are being imprisoned in Bahrain because they're Shia. We just can't say it's a configuration of the mind. At the end of the day, when you've got corpses, covering all the streets and prisons full of this minority or that minority, there is a reality to this rift. Now, whether it's manufactured or not is a different story. But the reality is there is a confrontation. And behind the Shia-Sunni thing, we have to mention the Iran-Arab thing, because Shiism in the Arab mind in the southern Persian Gulf is considered to be a personification of Iran's expansionism.
All right. We're unfortunately going to have to leave it there. I see Haytham Manna shaking his head.
But you forget modern and democratic project.
Yes. Which can help to overcome these differences.
To finish with this story.
Haytham Manna, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you very much. I want to thank Ardavan Amir Aslani, also Faisal Al-Yafai for being with us from Abu Dhabi, Olivier Daraj for joining us. Thank you for being with us here in the France